Now let's move on to a completely different story, because the size of the global economy could expand by as much as $7 trillion if investments in women are increased from their current levels. But that's according to panelists speaking at the Atlantic Council's recent Global Prosperity Forum. Now, that meeting centered on how to increase women empowerment in order to grow global developments. Let's take a listen.
Economic governance and kind of thinking about, as you said, the kind of macro picture. And this is in terms of fiscal policies, tariff policies. We talked about sort of the tax revenue and generation side. But we want to see, and we are seeing governments thinking how they're doing gender responsive budgeting, for example, or how you can implement tariff and tax policies to avoid so-called pink tariffs, which is the fact of where you have goods or services that women are more likely to use, often expensive. So this is, an issue about inflation, as you say, because women tend to bear the brunt of inflation in that way. So that's sort of the one bucket. But then there's also the whole slew of kind of sort of policies and laws that create the enabling environment. And we'll hear a lot more about this, I know, from Anne and Sophie, but create the enabling environment where women can participate in the labor force and start in their business. And that's, things related to living wages and pay equity, things related to leave policies and having flexibility. And then it's the slew, we talked a bit this morning about the importance of the sort of rule of law. So when you think about how those kinds of, whether it's property rights, inheritance laws, for agriculture-oriented economies, which are so many of the global South, where women play a huge role, how do we have land tenure and some of those kinds of laws on the books that can better, again, create that enabling environment where women can earn and thrive and protect their assets. And then, of course, investments in infrastructure. And we don't necessarily think of these as promoting women's economic empowerment. They're good for the economy and growth in general, but they can have particular impacts when done sensitively to the needs of women and safe transportation to get to and from work or school. When we want to think about the digital divide, and I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about the importance of digital financial systems and banking. We'll hear more about from my colleagues. And then, of course, we can't think about women's economic participation and the challenges that have been really brought to bear if we don't talk about care infrastructure. On average, somewhere between 2 and 40% of shares of GDP is accounted to women's unpaid work, which limits their ability to do paid work. And a lot of that is because the care infrastructure is not there. So that's a real big one. And then sort of, related to that enabling environment, just last point is, again, thinking about that downstream and thinking about investing in education and training, not only for young women. Female youth are much more likely to be unemployed or not in education or training, but also in aging society where women want to stay in the workforce longer and need to maybe have that training and reskilling in order to be able to stay and work.
How can local financial institutions and policymakers really invest in women and close often this big gap, particularly in access to capital?
The access to capital between men and women is strikingly different, with only 2% of capital going to women-led businesses. So that's strikingly abysmal. And if you think about access to finance more broadly, which is a key enabler of economic empowerment and prosperity and growth, you have more than 700 million women in the world that have access to no financial services at all, not even a mobile account. That's more than the population of Europe, to put it in perspective. You also mentioned, I like to put things in perspective, that $7 trillion could be generated in wealth and prosperity for the world with women's economic empowerment. That's twice what is needed to close the SDG gaps. So clearly a lot is at stake. Now, you're asking, what do policymakers and financial institutions need to do? And of course, there's a lot of things, but I'd like to simplify and focus on, the essence. So I'll say 2 things: data and innovation. And the first reason is, I think we need to make the case. What gets measured gets acted upon. The business case to serve women and the economic case to serve women is very strong. We just talked about the economic case. from a business perspective, there's also a very strong, and especially from a financial sector perspective, a very strong business case. Women tend to save more than men. Their propensity to save is higher, and the return on these savings is higher, as you mentioned. What is maybe less known is that women are also, in general, better borrowers than men. And for instance, the IFC has been publishing for 10 years data that shows that at the retail, micro, but also medium firm size, there is a 1% difference in favor of women in terms of non-performing loan, which is very significant. They're also typically more loyal customers. So first, you need to make the business case, and for that you need data. You need to understand who the women are that are underserved and compute the business opportunities. But then, even if you had that, serving women in their lived realities is often much more complicated than serving men for many of the reasons that, Nicole, you mentioned. And they typically relate to gender norms. So first, of course, as you mentioned, the labor force participation of women is significantly lower than men, 50% versus 80%. In some countries, South Asia, the Middle East, it's less than 30%. They're also more likely to be employed in agriculture, in gig work, in informal economies, which basically means that their cash flows tend to be lower and more volatile. So much more difficult for financial institutions to serve them, and much more costly. The transaction size is too small. In addition, because of all the reasons that you discussed this morning, women are often not able to produce to a financial institution the types of documentation that is needed. In particular, they're less likely to own assets, especially real estate assets that are needed for collateral in most jurisdictions. They're less likely to have the credit histories that are needed to base credit decision in most jurisdictions again. They're also less likely to be able to travel to a financial institution, sometimes to even interact with financial agents that are typically male in most countries. So there's a lot of gender norms and barriers that are related to the role of women in societies that make it more difficult for financial institutions to serve them. And yet there are solutions to that, and it's all about digital and data. You can assess the creditworthiness of a woman today using alternative data if she is digitally active, for instance, in an e-commerce platform. And you can do that with the same quality as with credit histories. You no longer need the collateral, probably.
And so when we work with entrepreneurs, we have really three ways that we think about this. The first is that we are actually trying to shift systems. We're not just accepting the status quo. And by definition, working with women in many of these economies is a shift. I'll never forget being in a room with some investors who said, the best way to get to women is shrink it and pink it. And I think we can go beyond that, right? So we're trying to transform those systems. The second thing is that we're looking at profit and people. It's not one or the other. And we believe that those two things can go hand in hand, and we've seen it. And the third thing is that we are looking for impact alongside of investment. And that's where it probably gets the most complicated, because we could spend a lot of time discussing over what time frame and what are the inputs that are also needed in addition to that investment. But we know from our work what it takes for women to succeed. And that is really the key, because it isn't about shrinking it and pinking it. And you've highlighted so well, I think, some of those barriers that need to be addressed if this investment is ever going to be used in meaningful ways. But one of the things I'd really like to highlight is that at Counterpart, we have a global network of women, entrepreneurs, who have gone through this training. The network itself dates back to 1978. It covers the globe. And so these women are peer-to-peer supports. They can be mentors to one another. They are certainly role models for one another to see who has done what and how have they succeeded. And all of them can be deployed in service of change in the ways that we talked about with transforming systems. And I think it's really important to, as we talk about women, really disaggregate that. Again, as Sophie said, really disaggregating that data because it's not a monolithic group. And the underserved and underrepresented people getting access to capital and decision-making opportunity, that's really, I believe, where the financial inclusion piece.